Good evening. You're very welcome. I'm Peter Dunne, and you're tuned into what is, sadly, the last episode of this, our new Farming, Food and Rural Affairs panel discussion show here on the Irish Inquiry channel, simply titled Grassroots. So, ladies and gentlemen, you're watching episode 8, our last episode in series 1 of Grassroots. And at this stage, I just want to say a particular thank you to the Irish Inquiry channel, to Stephen, and to all the backroom team for all of their technical prowess and indeed for providing the channel to us as a means of getting our message out there. And obviously for all of the technical backup and all of the advice that they've given us. Because as you can imagine, it takes a lot of background communication and coordination between lots of different people to get a program such as this to air. So again, we just like to pay a special tribute to them and say a big thank you for providing the platform and all of the background technical prowess. And also to you, our viewers, thank you for joining us this evening. And please be aware that you can also view our previous 7 episodes on all of our platforms. And by all means, please feel free to provide some feedback to us in terms of what you think of the program and provide, please, if you will, some suggestions, recommendations, observations on topics that we might discuss or how we might indeed improve the program. So tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to discuss the issue of where farmers get their information, or indeed where should they get their information. Is this a conversation we need to have? In other words, about how best to provide farmers with the best advice and education and information we can to help them to make their businesses work, to produce abundant food, to remain profitable, and to protect the environment. And we are delighted, ladies and gentlemen, to be joined this evening by Mike Walsh, who is a lecturer and researcher from Waterford Institute of Technology. And again, as with all of our guests, we'd like to pay a special tribute and say a big thank you to Mike for giving up of his time so freely and generously on this Wednesday evening. Now, before we get going, and since this is the last episode in Series 1 of Grassroots, we thought maybe we might do a slight pivot and just have a brief commentary on some of this week's rather strange geopolitical events. So here we go. Sources have revealed that events this week in Belarus, where a Ryanair jet en route from Greece to Lithuania was intercepted by a Belarusian MiG fighter jet and forced to land at Minsk, have raised speculation about the possibility of a colour revolution in the allegedly beleaguered Eastern European state. Insider sources have revealed that Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, should he be ousted from his lofty perch, the EU may offer him asylum in the Republic of Ireland as a penalty for his affront to democracy. This is a prospect that Lukashenko is said to privately savour, as he is eager to do some salmon fishing on the Moy and to become more sophisticated in his knowledge of tyrannical tools and techniques. It has been rumoured that in such an eventuality, the Green Party have speculated that they might run him as a general election candidate in County Clare. One troubled local councillor who didn't wish to be named is alleged to have been heard opining, "What are these lads up to in Dublin? Did they want this lad to start lighting fires on Loop Head for the next time Russian Tupolovs decide to buzz the West Coast?" This was perceived as a particularly troubling eventuality, as rumour has it that the Russian Air Force has been infiltrated by a faction of woke vegan activists who have allegedly threatened to target every pig farm in Kerry should the opportunity ever present itself. Meanwhile, keenly aware of the speculations surrounding Lukashenko and anxious not to let the opportunity to avail of the talents of such a notable strongman go a-begging, it has been rumoured that Fine Gael might run Lukashenko in a Dublin constituency, if ever he is granted asylum, with an eye to cleaning up the city. One local activist was rumoured to have said, "Well, if we want the chance to have the streets clean enough that people can eat their dinner off him, why pass up the chance to get this guy? Dublin could be modelled on Minsk. And not to be outdone by controversy, rumours emerged that Michael O'Leary has decided that the next two bull calves in his famed Gigginstown Angus herd will be called Alexander and Lukashenko in respective order. As sources close to the Ryanair executive and business titan have said that O'Leary's view is that if Lukashenko is going to shaft anybody, he might as well be in a position to make a boatload of money out of it. So, some commentary there on the news, folks, and a slight humorous take on events this week. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to turn to more serious matters now. And I'd like to welcome onto the final episode of Grassroots tonight's guest, who is Mike Walsh, who is a lecturer and researcher from Waterford Institute of Technology. Now, Mike, you're very, very welcome onto Grassroots, and thank you for giving us, an hour or so on your Wednesday night. Mike, can you maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and where you're coming from, please?
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. It's nice to be asked along to take part. So I'm from a farming background in Ireland, in Waterford originally, and I've been involved in agriculture always. Worked overseas for quite some time as well. Visited Australia, New Zealand, US, and a bit of Europe, North Africa, Middle East. So yeah, I've a bit of a background in agriculture, I'll say, from a range of different climates and regions. But back to Ireland, came back, did my initial agricultural education, an ag science degree in UCD, and then after some further travel again, came back to Ireland again and came back into WIT to follow up for more research there, and I've never escaped. I'm still there, but more involved now in lecturing and some agricultural research, particularly in the area of environment, which is where pretty much everything is being focused at the moment, and rightly so. Yeah.
Oh, great stuff, Mike. No, thank you very much. And as I want to do, I sort of feel a deep responsibility to listen intently to everything our guests say, and because it is free form, and it's non-adversarial, we obviously we all understand that. And I just want to pick up on a couple of points, Mike, that you raised there, and really two questions spring to mind, and I'll go with the first one first, and maybe then, we'll talk about some of the research that you're involved in and what context that sits in. But you would have done quite a considerable time overseas. How important, Mike, do you think it is? In an agricultural context for people engaged in whether it be production agriculture, or whether it indeed be agribusiness, whether it be farming, whether it be farming education, maybe in particular, that people have actually experienced agriculture as it's practiced, in many, many different contexts, in many different environments, in many different cultures, rather than just being honed in, what some might see as really a bubble that's very susceptible to groupthink. How important do you think it is to have the broad range of knowledge that someone like yourself has had?
Well, I think one of the main things to look at, the area that a lot of people will focus on almost immediately there is animal welfare, for instance, and how we treat animals. And lots of people have their own concept and their own ideas of what the animal's like or how we should treat animals. But very few people actually look and give the animals a choice, as to what type of environment they want. there was some research done back 2008, 2009 in Harper Adams, I think, and what they found with dairy cows, they had cows coming out of a milking parlour every day for a month. They were about 120 days into lactation, and every second day the cows come up to the end of a T-junction, and today they went left out into a paddock for grazing, and tomorrow they'll go right into a cubicle with stalls and their feed left in front of them. And that ran for about a month. It was left, right, and after a month they let the cows walk up to the T-junction and both gates were open, and over 60% of the cows, and with a slight bias towards the higher producing cows, chose to go right and into the stalls for their feed and a comfortable lie down. So that was the animals given free choice, and this is in summertime with mixed weather conditions. So most people would probably have thought that the cows would head outside, but that wasn't the case in that research. And there's very little other similar research being done, because people don't put that kind of emphasis on it. They're not looking at what the animals want or giving the animals choice as to what they want. And that's one of the things we look at. And if we look at milk production, for instance, globally, dairy milk production, with high volume dairy cows, almost 80% of that from the higher volume section is indoor. And those animals produce very well as long as the conditions are good and as long as the nutrition is good. And that's a major area that we need to look at, I think. So we will have different reactions from people in different parts of the world, and you're right. If you don't look at what's happening outside the fence, then you're only familiar with what's happening inside your own gate. And we do need to look at what other people are doing, because the bottom line is we're competing on a world scale now. There's no such thing as local competition is not an issue anymore. It's global competition, and we're competing on a global market. So we have to be better than everybody else and more efficient than everybody else. Bottom line.
And just on that, Mike, in terms of that research, if I can maybe pull up something there. I mean, that result probably would have surprised a lot of people and surprised me, because I thought a lot of the cows might actually go, for, well, weather conditions permitting, if it's a nice sunny summer day. And I mean, you have a lot of sort of nice, a lot of nice vegetation, a lot of, perennial ryegrass, high in water soluble carbohydrates, it's been actively photosynthesizing. The cows are going to go mad for it, but of course we know that, rarely is it ever as simple as that. And the thought struck me then, when you mention, high yielding, high production, and you focus on efficiency, has there been too much of a focus on efficiency at the expense of, let's say, other metrics, particularly in relation to what is broadly termed now, and it is a bit of a buzzword, but what's broadly termed sustainability? Have we focused too much on efficiency and maybe not enough on things like, for example, robusticity and hardiness and this notion of, as well, which is key, having the right animal in the right system, and having the right animal in the right context? Has there been too much focus on a sort of a if you like, formulaic advice, really, just one size fits all advice?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions there.
Sorry, I tend to ask long-winded questions, Mike. My apologies.
Maybe if we just pick out genetics, right? Beef genetics are not very good for meat production, and people will argue that milk genetics are not good for beef production. But what you'll find generally with high genetic milk producing cows, for instance, Holstein cows, what you've got there, you've got a really good ability to produce high volumes of milk. The quality of the milk that they produce in terms of milk solids is excellent, provided the diet is balanced and the animals are on a proper plane of nutrition. So if we've got an animal producing 40 kilos of milk, that animal is going to need a much higher energy density than an animal only capable of producing 20 or 25 kilos of milk. Because genetically, they're bred for feed conversion efficiency. Now, looking at focusing on the genetics, if we take the male or the steers from a dairy herd, we've got the same genes. So the same feed conversion efficiency is there, and we were using these same genetics in the Middle East, in the middle of the desert, producing milk and producing high volumes of milk. But we were able to take the steers, the male calves, and bring them up to 500 kilos in the first 11 to 13 months. That was the range because that was the market in that area. But all we had to do was put in the right plane of nutrition. We knew the genes are there. So you just feed the animal what they need to achieve that performance, and they'll do it. So what you're looking at there is an animal that has a really good feed conversion efficiency capability, versus if you take a continental beef animal and put the same plane of nutrition in there, you will get weight gain. You'll get a similar weight gain, but you'll get a much higher conversion to fat rather than muscle or protein. So you're not going to end up with as good an animal. So that's something we need to consider more. Trying to use a multi-purpose breed. You're getting away from the efficiency. You neither have a beef animal or a dairy animal. So we need to be more careful about how we select animals to fit in where we need them to fit in.
Okay, and I suppose just on that, Mike, just a very quick question. Do you see a context in Ireland where dual purpose breeds, you're thinking of your Fleckvieh, your sort of typical Central European sort of, dual purpose breed, do they have a role to play here?
I think we're moving very strongly. Like the beef industry is not very profitable here at the moment for the producer. So we seem to be moving very swiftly towards a much higher percentage of dairy and milk production and reducing the amount of beef production. So taking that overall, I think we should be looking more at not so much at a dual purpose animal, but concentrating more on milk production if that's where we're going. And that seems to be where we're going.
Okay, absolutely. I mean, what I want to try and maybe cover as much ground as possible, Mike. And obviously, I want to ask you some questions about what your current program of research is involved in looking at in WIT. But just to come back to a second question from your initial introduction, you were saying that you went to UCD, I'd say back in the day, and I'm guessing it's probably a good few years before myself. Well, I was almost in this century, but back in the last century too. And I think we're both fairly, we're fairly similar up on top. So anyway, the question I have, Mike, really is in terms of what you learned and what you experienced in UCD back in the day. How was that different, do you think, from what's being taught nowadays, because you are actively involved in education. And how is it different, and what are the main things, do you think, that have changed during all that time?
I think firstly, not enough has changed. That, when you look at the curriculum there at the moment, there's not huge change even from back in the late 80s, early 90s up to today. There should be, because the markets are more global today. I say we're not so much local anymore. So we should have moved on. We should have progressed a lot faster than we did. But we are taking a step. I'm not sure about anybody else, but in WIT we're moving forward, we think, at a fairly good pace. We have quite a lot on the burner at the moment in terms of the type of research we're looking at and how we can bring farming right into and lead up in the 21st century. And of course, you have, animal welfare and environment right at the top of the agenda there. And that's where everything is moving very quickly. We didn't have social media, we didn't have internet, we didn't have any of that back in the 80s and early 90s, but it's all there today. So now today, because of that, the consumer takes a much bigger role in everything we're doing. And we have to consider that first. And personally, I think this is terrific, because it's an opportunity for institutes now and education institutes to engage directly with the consumer, if you like. So we should be putting everything right out there and giving the consumer access and showing them what's happening, what we're doing, why we're doing it, why we're going in this direction, what impact that's going to have on their lives and what they eat. That's where we need to be today.
I did have a question in mind, Mike, which was to ask you next about the type of research you're engaged in, and I'm really keen to do that. But again, something you've said there that I just picked up on, the two big issues, and I know we had a bit of a chat before the show, as I do with all the guests, rather than bring people in completely cold. And again, it is free form, it's non-adversarial. So you mentioned something there, and I wanted to pick up on it. Are the two big issues, or the two big issues, and I know there are others that you would see, not just farmer education, but also consumer education, and of course you touched on that there, and how important are each of those, farmer education and consumer education, and then I maybe come to, and next you're moving on from that, what are the other big issues, do you think?
Consumer education is okay. I will go back to the educational institutes, the universities. It's up to us to get it right. It's we're educating the consumer, we're educating the farmer. And we need to make sure we get that right. If we don't, and if we're not out there and seen to be out there providing information, then the consumer is going to go elsewhere for their education. And how good is the information they're getting? Is it marketing based? Is it agribusiness based? Or is it science based? And we need to provide the science-based information, and we need to make it very, very easy to access for the consumer and for the farmer. And we need to bring it back to basics and make it understandable as well. So that's up to us to do that. And we need to be accessible to everybody to be able to do that.
Okay. And I mean, there's probably some questions which that nice, very nice and concise contribution leads on to as well. But what I'm really keen as well to get into, Mike, and I know you're very good to come on here and give up probably. I mean, we'll go for, I think we'll go for the hour. We might, we're not being chased by advertising revenue or anything, so we can go a little bit over if we need to. But the kind of research that you're doing, Mike, at WIT, particularly in relation to issues like grazing management and the type of swards that farmers use, and multi-species and phytodiversity, can you give us an indication about the type of research you're engaged in?
Well, we just last year got our land area set up, and we're hoping to really expand on that now over the next couple of years. We've got in our trial plots. We put in 1,400 trial plots down our trials area. We have a couple of companies from other countries looking at different materials in there at the moment, at different research work. So we're looking at, we're trying to cover as much as we can in a small space of time in a small area, and get as much information as we can from it. And our location there is quite good. It's just beside the Greenway, so we hope to be able to put all that information give the public direct access, so as they're passing along beside the trials, they can look at our research on the board there as soon as we get that sorted out, but also to log in to a web page where they will get detail on all of the trial work that we're doing there. We have tillage systems, we have no-till system side by side on the same site. So we can compare one against the other, one type of system, the conventional tillage versus min-till or no-till. We've got a range of monoculture grasses in there and mixed species also. So we've got on the monocultures, we're just using ryegrass, the standard silage sward. On the mixed species, we went for a couple of different options. One of them we termed a winter hardy species, where we took the last harvest of that whole area last October, and that winter hardy species has a percentage of Westerwold grass in there. Now, a lot of people mightn't be familiar with that. It's very similar to an RVP or an Italian ryegrass, but it's a very hardy species, and it grows right over the winter period. I'll just try to pull up some data here on that. We put that in, say, middle of summer last year, took the harvest off it, and at the end of the year, that species in tons per hectare, we came out with just short of 11 tons over that period from October to April this year. That is a hell of a volume of material. And we also have other species in there. We have a legume mix, just red clovers. There's 4 different varieties of red clovers, and that came up to 6 tons of dry matter per hectare, and we were absolutely amazed at that. We didn't expect that to perform that well over that period, but most of that, whereas the winter hardy species was a gradual accumulation, the legumes was just over the last 28, 30 days, really. It really performed very well. And all that was all harvested again. It'll be 2 weeks next Friday. But then we had other species. We have a 4-species mix where we have clovers, timothy and ryegrasses. We have an 8-species mix where we have ryegrasses, timothys, fescues, and legumes, red and white clover, and then we have multi-species. We have 15 species where we have grasses, legumes, and herbs. So in that one, we have ryegrasses, timothies, fescues on the grass side. We have red clover, white clover, burswood trefoil, vetch, alside clover, and then we've got herbs in there as well. There's sheep's sorrel, sheep's burnet. There's a very broad range of different species in that mix, and it's performing really well also. Yeah.
And it's probably important to say, Mike, as well, that, and obviously one of the main reasons for using phytodiversity, or multi-species, multiple species, is that am I correct in saying none of these plots have nitrogen fertilizer applied?
Well, that's one of the trials we're looking at. We are applying nitrogen to a range of plots the whole way across the site, so that we can compare the performance with nitrogen versus without nitrogen. And what we found on that first harvest is the ryegrasses and the 4 species and 8 species mix, both those mixes, and the winter hardy mix, all performed a little bit better with nitrogen than without nitrogen. And they performed a little bit better on the tillage area. The straight ryegrass, that performed a little bit better on the tillage area than it did on the no-till area. But overall, right across the board, if we tot up all the results, the mixed species overall outperformed the plots even with chemical nitrogen. What we found was when we applied chemical nitrogen onto the mixtures with a lot of legumes and herbs in them, it tended to suppress the performance of those mixtures, whereas the same mixtures where there was no nitrogen applied, they perform much better. And overall, those mixed species perform better than the monoculture ryegrass with and without nitrogen.
Okay, so I mean, in terms of, really the impetus for all of this research, reducing the, if you will, the energy inputs, the fossil fuel derived energy inputs that come from chemical nitrogen or synthetic nitrogen, is really one of the main, I think, drivers behind the if you like, movement to increase phytodiversity and to move away from monocultures in grassland. And how important, Mike, is, because and we would have discussed this, the cows and the carbon is billed as the main problem in terms of one of those issues that agriculture has and has to address and has to try to sort out. And is that an accurate portrayal of the real, at least in an Irish context, where the real problem lies? Or is the real problem actually reactive nitrogen, in the biosphere, in soil and water and air? Is that something you'd like to comment on, Mike?
Well, in terms of if we look at the cows again, we did some trial work, not last summer, the previous summer, where we applied nitrogen at the normal rate on 1/3 of a paddock. The next third was half normal rate, and the last area got no nitrogen. Right, where we applied, we did that on a series of paddocks and just opened the gate and let the cows in and watched what happened. And we did grass measurements before and afterwards. And what we found was that where we had applied a full rate of nitrogen, the grass is just a little bit higher, so it was easier for the cows to eat. So they went in hungry into the paddock, and the majority of the cows, 80% of the cows, would concentrate for 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes on that area to try and get a quick fill. But once they got to that point, then they migrated across and started grazing on the zero nitrogen area. But when the cows moved on to the next paddock and we went back in and measured the grass residue, we found that there was a higher number of kilos per hectare of grass left on the higher nitrogen area than on the zero nitrogen area. So even though the grass is a little bit shorter and it was harder for the cows to graze, they cleaned up that area better where there was no nitrogen applied. So basically what we were looking at there again is, if the cows had a choice, would they eat grass with nitrogen or without nitrogen? And from what we found in that research is that they prefer grass without nitrogen. So if we look at putting in mixed species sports, in particular multi-species, then we get a much better reaction from the animals. And apart from the animals preferring forage without a lot of chemical nitrogen applied to it, it's not only will they eat it or what they eat, but it's what happens to it when it goes into the rumen. The maximum protein, crude protein amount that we should be putting into any rumen is 16%. Over that, we start running into inefficiencies because the animal doesn't need any more than that, no matter what level of production they're at. If they're at a higher production level, they need more energy, not more protein. So if we put cows out on grass that has received a lot of chemical nitrogen, we can have anything up to 26, 27, 28% protein on that, depending on what time of year, how much nitrogen was applied. We shouldn't be applying that much. Even the general guidelines are 1 unit of nitrogen a day, and absolutely shouldn't go over that. But even at that, with nice warm conditions and early spring growth and warm soil conditions now, and you're going to see this happening in the next couple of weeks, soil temperatures are going to come up even more. So there's going to be a release of background natural nitrogen. You have to add that onto the nitrogen you're applying. So those grasses are going to come up maybe 24, 25, 26% protein, which is almost 10% excess. So the cow has to get rid of, once that gets into the rumen, right, it's broken down very quickly. And the better your grass management, the better digestibility you've got, the faster degradation you get with that material in the rumen. So that's releasing ammonia and nitrogen up in the dome and the rumen at a phenomenal rate. That ammonia is absorbed through the rumen wall directly into the bloodstream. That's the problem. Now you've got a high amount of nitrogen in there. If the animal doesn't get rid of that, she'll die of nitrogen poisoning, and that'll happen very, very quickly. So the mechanism there is the animal in the liver, take 1 carbon, 2 nitrogens, 4 hydrogens, and that's synthesized there into a urea molecule. And now the cow can urinate that out. Right? Each molecule of urea takes 4 ATPs of energy. So there's a massive waste of energy there because you're feeding too much protein.
Absolutely. And
right?
if
you're on something like a multi-species that you don't need to put nitrogen on, you won't have got up to that level of protein. It'll be much lower. You'll be back maybe 18, 19%, which is still too high, but much closer to where it should be.
And that's really leads me into another question, Mike, and another related topic, because you've kind of covered some of the basics of sort of ruminology there and sort of ruminant science, and because of this focus on what I'll call it the New Zealand model, if I may. I mean, this monoculture of ryegrass, high nitrogen, even splits. I mean, even if it's not all applied at once. I mean, and there are other collateral issues like short residuals, golf ball grazing that guys talk about. But really, what the one of the issues that really isn't spoken about, it's almost the issue that dare not speak its name. This imbalance, the protein energy imbalance that you get around this time of the year with high nitrogen ryegrass monocultures, and because of that, you're having to, I mean, particularly in the parlor, you're having to balance that with a high energy, high fermentable carb ration. And what that actually, in the aggregate for the country, what that translates into is lots of feed imports. And I mean, so in other words, you're kind of getting into this vortex of, a solution to one particular challenge creates another set of challenges, and that creates another set of challenges. So you get into this kind of this negative kind of vortex. Is that something you'd like to maybe comment on, Mike? This issue of feed imports and how the entire system feeds into that?
Well, yeah, you're right. And if we're looking for decent production from our cows, we're going to have to put enough energy into them. But we can get most of the way in that area by not by having to add in high energy concentrates, but just by getting better feed conversion efficiency with what is going in there. And by cutting back on nitrogen and bringing back the protein levels closer to where they should be, say back closer to that 16%, it's going to do that automatically. So the feed that is diverted toward the energy that is diverted towards maintenance and production, is all utilized in that instance, and there isn't any energy loss in trying to process excess nitrogen out of the system. So we could go a hell of a long ways from where we are, just by removing that high protein from the diet. And we can easily do that, say, by pulling back on nitrogen and using mixed species. Now, again, when you say mixed species, this is not a new concept by any means. I came back to Ireland in 91. And since then, there's several very good seed mixes around with very, very high quality red and white clovers. We have Timothy grasses in there and fescues, and those blends are around there for the last 20 years, and we've been using them for the last 20 years. The biggest problem I had initially was convincing the farmer not to put chemical nitrogen on them. Just get the seed in the ground, get it growing, and let nature do its course then. And quite a lot of those farmers, even 12, 15 years later, are still looking at those same mixtures. They're using them still, and they have, if not eliminated nitrogen, they have pulled it away back. And there's better production, there's better fertility, there's not as many feed problems, there's more profit, bottom line.
And I mean, the thing is, Mike, then as well, with, there are so many other collateral benefits then from the multi-species sward in terms of the the differential rooting depths and root architecture and root structure and how that interacts with the soil. So it's one way to relieve compaction. One thing that's often mentioned as well is with things like chicory, I think with plantain, but with certain other species, then the anthelmintics. I haven't seen a huge amount of research on that, but there is a lot of anecdotal evidence. So again, it's another means of maybe reducing anthelmintic usage. So again, that's another target, another metric in terms of sustainability where we can improve the system. As well as flat, literally, and I know it's a phrase that we've all come to be familiar with in the last year in another context, flattening the curve, flattening the production curve, which has its own benefits. are all of those things, where would you stand on all of those things in terms of the benefits that accrue from all of those as well?
Well, again, with mixed species, to say, and they can be reasonably diverse. You don't have to have everything in there. You do get a much better mineral profile as well, as you alluded to there. You have different root depths, so you're going to pull up different nutrients from different layers that monoculture ryegrass doesn't have that root structure to get down there to be able to pull up those range of minerals, and the first thing we should always look at when we're looking at any kind of forage or feed analysis, whether it's a pasture or a silage, whatever it might be, whatever type of feed it is, we should look at the macro mineral profile area: calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, sodium, chloride, sulfur. They're the building blocks. They're the foundation stones for absolutely everything that happens in there. All of that process of breaking down material in the rumen. You've got live cultures in there. You've got bacteria, protozoa, there's fungi, and that all of that microflora is what breaks down all that material, and they need to be fed. But for all of this to happen, they need assistance, if you like, because they're tiny little entities. So a lot of this breakdown of material is chemical, and if you don't have the chemical balances right, your sodium chloride ratios, your magnesium potassium ratios, your calcium phosphorus ratios, they have to be right. If there's an imbalance there, then no matter what you do, you're not going to get the efficiency that you need. You need to correct that imbalance first. And with multi-species, we have much better chance of getting a good mix of all of those macros in there. That'll bring us closer to that point. So it's very, very important. It's not just the volume, it's not just the protein and the carbohydrate and the fibers. We really need to focus in on that macro mineral content as well. And there's huge benefits there.
And just, have you seen anything, Mike, in the literature or in the research in terms of the impact that, I'll say phytodiversity, ever the academic, but phytodiversity, by which I mean multiple species. Have you seen anything in the literature or even in the popular press, the farming press, about the impact that multiple species has on your rumen and your metabolic problems, things like bloat, things like tetany, things like milk fever? I mean, I can imagine, you could virtually eliminate those with the right mix of plant species in the right setting.
Yeah, you hit on one or two there. Okay, yeah. Again, I go back to the macrominerals. Most of those problems like milk fever and tetany, they'll come from macromineral imbalance again. So if you're able to get plant species that in your particular area, whether that's your local farm or your country or whatever, you go after the species that can pull up a better mix of those macros, and you're heading in the right direction. So you very likely will see benefits, rather than having to add them in, to the diet. In some cases you might have, if you're in an area where there's a deficiency, say in magnesium or phosphorus, if it's not there in the soil, you're going to have to add it into the diet at some point. But you need to know that. You need to know that issue is there, and get that balance right. And you mentioned bloat, and a lot of people will say, well, if we go for these multi-species, or if we go for a legume sport, what about bloat? And generally we're finding where we are using, I say we've been using those mixed species for the last 20 odd years or more, Once we hit, we've taken silage off some of those swarts now. Soil temperatures have gone up. Once they recover now, it's going to be 70–80% clover. We'll have some fescues, we'll have timothies, those type of grasses coming through, because they're not as dependent on chemical nitrogen, which we're not giving them. And the animals are grazing those swarts with no problem, because we're not applying chemical nitrogen. But the digestibility of all of those type of swarts is very high. So if we apply chemical nitrogen to those with that type of digestibility and that sort of, firstly, we'll suppress the legume production, which we don't want to do. We want to get better performance. But secondly, we're increasing the nitrogen content, because it will lift some of that nitrogen. And then we end up with a huge problem in the rumen, like I explained earlier, with the release of ammonia and nitrogen, because those products they're more highly digestible than ryegrasses, so they'll break down even faster. And then you run into bloat problems. The bloat problems, okay, they eventually show up as gas in the rumen that the animal can't belch out, and you get frotting, and the animal just swell up, and with pressure on the lungs and the heart, they die. But the problem happens before that. The problem happens because they've got too much nitrogen in there, and there's too much ammonia getting into the bloodstream. The animal gets nitrogen poisoning because they can't process that out quickly enough. Liver is just not able to do it. There's too big a load. So the animal's metabolism slows down, but that's because of the nitrogen load. So then they can't belch. They lose the awareness of where they are, and then they start to swell up, and then you get frotting and bloat, and then you have dead animals. But the problem is not coming just from bloat out of nowhere. It's coming from that excess of nitrogen going into the rumen. So in terms of somebody being a little bit hesitant of having a high legume content in a sward, it's not an issue, as long as you don't put chemical nitrogen on it. And you'll find if you don't, you don't need to. It's going to perform anyway.
No, so in a sense, having multiple species in the sward is, if anything, it's an assurance for the farmer that they can, on the one hand, maintain production close to, or possibly in the ballpark, or maybe even exceed what they might get with a ryegrass nitrogen type system, but also that they're not, that they're not going to get some of the major, metabolic problems, or even just the nutritional imbalances that we spoke about. But then, Mike, to play devil's advocate,
if we just, before we move on,
yep.
Like I mentioned earlier, let's say we give the animals a choice here. If you've got farmers going out reseeding this year, you might have 2, maybe 3 paddocks that you want to reseed. So put your normal mix, whatever you might do, in 50% of the paddock, and put a mixed species in the other 50%. And on that mixed species where there's no, don't put chemical nitrogen on that. Treat the other half as you would normally, but just put in that mixed species on half the paddock, and don't put chemical nitrogen on it. And every time the cows come around to that, you watch the animals and see which is their preference. What will they graze first? How well will they graze it? And how well will they perform from it? If you've got 50% of the paddock only, say for 3 or 4 paddocks, and half of that is a multi-species, half is your normal farming regime. Over 4 days, 4 paddocks, you observe what the cows do on that, and look at what volume of milk you have in the tank at the end of that part of your grazing rotation. So just take it one step at a time. Do a little experiment on your own farm.
That was actually my next question, and you've answered it. And I suppose it's a two-component question. Then another part of the question is, let's play, and I'm playing devil's advocate, let's say, and maybe a lot of guys might say, this is a bit of a bandwagon, I'm not going to jump on this, I don't want to change, or, this is something everyone wants to be involved in it now, and sure, look at in 5 or 6 years time, it's a flash in the pan. Because I don't want to change, or I can't change. And what would you say to somebody in that position? And then maybe that they've decided to take the leap, and they might say, you know what, maybe I'll try it. How many species should they put in? So you've outlined it very, very nicely. Just dip your toe in the water, do a small scale, part of a field. How many species should they put in, and how should they manage it then? Because guys are going to say, look, I can put in 15 species, but in 2 years' time, like half of them aren't going to be there. What's the point? And what would you say to that, Mike?
If you have if you get your normal grass seeds, I think you'll be looking at somewhere around mid-70s, about 75 euros per acre. To put in a mixed species, you're probably looking at about 90 to 95, somewhere in around there. So it's not going to cost an awful lot extra. And as far as how persistent they will be and how many species you will have left in 2 years' time or 3 years' time, if you put chemical nitrogen on that mixed species, then in 3 years' time, you will most likely have 10% and you'll have 90% ryegrass, because that's all you're feeding. You don't need to put chemical nitrogen on a mixed species. So that, that's the first thing they need to understand. It will perform just as well as your normal ryegrass. It'll perform better than most of your normal monoculture ryegrass mixtures without any chemical nitrogen. Once you start applying that nitrogen, that's when you start to lose the species and performance. To broaden that answer a little bit, maybe, what do we put in? I would start off with at least an 8 species mix. For me personally, I go for a 14, 15 species mix or more. Put in a very diverse mix in there. Your management system, your soil type, your soil depth, your location, whether you're near the sea or well sheltered or high elevation or low elevation. There's a huge number of different influential factors which will determine what you end up with in 3, 4, 5, 6 years' time. I remember I have one student back from 2009 was going to do an organic farming, and we were looking at what to put in then, and we put in a very simple 2 species mix. We put in red clover and timothy. I was talking to him in 2019, 10 years later. He's still grazing that same mix, hasn't touched it since, hasn't got any nitrogen at all over that time, and is really happy how the animals are performing on that. So it can be that simple, or it can be very, very diverse. So I would put in a multi-species mix, manage it as best you can, and depending on your soil type, as I said, and soil nutrient background and climatic conditions and drainage and so on, you may very well lose 2 or 3 or 4 species, but the ones that survive, they're the species that are most suited to that particular location. So you manage those and you work off of those. So if you want to go again, then maybe look at those species and go more for a mix with that type of mix, rather than trying to broaden it to something that may not work. But I think, how are you going to find that out? The only way you're going to find it out on your location, on your site, is to put in a good diverse mix to start with.
Right. So in context, yeah, context is everything. So, I mean, it could be a completely different mix that works for a farmer, who's at 500 meters maybe in West Cork, as opposed to, on a south-facing slope, as opposed to a farmer who's in South Wicklow or North Wexford at 100 meters elevation, an east-facing slope. So it could be the context there is completely different. It could be two completely different eventual sward compositions after 4 or 5 grazing seasons.
Yeah, and it'll depend. What is it grazing? Is it a grazing cut? Is it for silage only?
Yeah.
And that's another point. I mean, people don't consider legumes only for silage. There was research done in Grange quite a few years back where they did grass silage, grass and clover silage, and clover silage. And that was for beef cattle, and brought them in over the winter and did a comparison on the performance on those. And I just pulled the result up here. The difference between the different silages. Grass silage, the live weight gain per day was 0.59 kilos. That was on grass silage. Grass white clover silage, 0.83 kilos per day. And red clover silage, 1.04 kgs per day live weight gain. And that's 100% red clover mix versus grass and white clover mix 50-50 versus grass silage. So look at the performance that's available there. And that red clover would have performed very well with zero nitrogen.
And
so
in terms then of
down.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a positive result in nitrogen. In terms of just comment on grazing management, Mike, because you change the sward, you change how that sward derives its fertility, you got to change the management. Do enough guys realize that? What kind of, like, for example, maybe it's a simple question. What kind of rotation length are you looking at in a multi-species sward as opposed to the traditional system? It's say 30 days. I mean, do you need to go longer? Presumably do.
I think 21 days is the standard recommended. I think for a monoculture ryegrass, and that's to get the optimum digestibility from the pasture, but also to utilize that unit of nitrogen per day. And that ryegrass requires that nitrogen to perform. If you don't put it on it, you won't get the performance. So I think that management system is to cater for a monoculture and also to cater for the amount of nitrogen that's in the system in that pasture. But if you're looking at multi-species, well, depending what kind of animals you have, what lactation stage they're at, and what you're looking for overall, you have more scope to extend that grazing period for a little bit or to shorten it for a little bit, either. If it goes over 21 days or closer to 28 days, you don't lose digestibility so easily. You get a lot more volume over that last week. If you look at ryegrass production, the real bulk of your volume only comes in the last couple of days before the animals get back into the paddock. Now, if you could add an extra week onto that and maintain your digestibility, look at the benefit there. You'll almost double your volume in terms of dry matter over that last week. So there's a huge advantage there as well, and you won't lose that digestibility.
Okay, this is a sort of, I mean, again, when we talked before, I said no sneaky questions, nothing out of left field. But this just struck me then, as you mentioned the silage. Do you have a view, Mike, on, like, I'm actually looking out the road here in front of the house today, and there's lads bombing up and down all day with trailer loads of silage. And
You're looking at
do you,
tomorrow's forecast.
do you that's yeah. Do you have a view on the use of contractors and silage? Do you think that the proliferation of contractors has, or how has it? I should be careful about the question I ask. How has it, or has it impacted silage quality across in any way?
I think most contractors are very well equipped.
Hmm.
The equipment they have is colossally expensive. With silage, you need to get the job done at the right time, and you need to get it done quickly. Um, so if the individual farmers were to invest in equipment to try and do that, it just wouldn't be possible. So farmers or contractors play a very crucial role there. But I think we should we shouldn't just look at contractors to come in and cut silage. We should look at contractors to cut silage if you need to spread fertilizer. If we go down multi-species route, we don't need them to spread that much fertilizer. Just keep an eye on the P's and the K's and keep that right. Keep an eye on magnesium, keep that right. You'll be going down more the road of you really need to keep an eye on your soil pH to keep the performance coming there. So it's more getting that right and trying to reduce the chemical fertilizer input, go for multi-species, deeper rooting instead to pull up a more diverse range of macros that you don't have to apply so much chemicals. You can get rid of nitrogen out of the system completely. Slurry spreading, that's another one should be the contractor, and rather than every farmer going out with a slurry tank and doing a lot of damage probably and not in the right conditions and trying to get out under pressure, a contractor with a cord system can get out there with a low tire pressure machine and not do any damage. But again, even in that, we need to look at the volumes that we're putting out. If anyone is putting out more than or heading up on, if we go back to old money, 1,500 gallons of slurry per acre, 2 hours later, you just go out and walk up the track where that slurry tank moved, and you'll count hundreds of dead earthworms up along that track. You're right on the borderline. There's a lot of damage going on there. So that's a whole other area that we need to look at. And I think it could be better managed overall.
And then do you think, Mike, that just on foot of that, is it slurry per se, or is it just excessive volumes? And basically, are people driving the system too hard?
I think excessive volumes at any one application. Yeah. Some people look at slurry as a waste product. It's not. It's a nutrient, and it's really good, but it has to be managed.
Okay, and I mean, there's a whole series of other, collateral issues there with, in terms of, we could talk. We've gone over the hour. We've gone quite a bit over the hour, Mike. I mean, the time does fly. I mean, we're a little bit over the hour, but we're having what I would like to call, ladies and gentlemen, a rich, an information-rich environment here with our guest this evening, ladies and gentlemen, who is Mike Walsh from Waterford IT, and Mike is really giving us some. He's schooling us here in lots of areas, and we really appreciate that. The thing is, Mike, I suppose, to follow on then from the the whole issue of slurry, and it's something we might even be able to get into in another time. The issue of fertilizer and the issue of how much is being applied, because we weaved a thread through the conversation tonight that it is really where our that interaction between farming and the environment, that's where the big ticket item is, the big target item is, if we want to actually mitigate the negative effects on the environment of agriculture. That's, I think, probably where we have to target. Just looking at the figures, Mike, you may have seen these yourselves. from the Farming Independent last Tuesday, where the total fertilizer I think it's import. Sorry, it says sales in the article. Total fertilizer, just over 934,000 tons, 2021, and in 1920 it was 747,000 tons. So they're saying 25% increase. We're looking at the compounds, we're looking at straights, we're looking at urea, we're looking at protected urea. So all of these issues, Mike, how important are these in terms of, and even in terms of some of these mooted new technologies that we hear talked about, protected urea, and we got to a subject you've touched on, nitrogen use efficiency, which is valid, but it's how you do it. So this resort to chemical interventions to actually protect urea, is that wise? How should that be approached in future?
We're back to where we started.
Yeah, come full circle.
Yeah. There's a couple of things I think that are glaringly obvious. And you mentioned nitrogen usage there. In 2018, if we look at the elemental nitrogen, you mentioned a figure there of close to 900,000 tons. But that is chemical fertilizers, and those fertilizers will have a blend of NP and K or various different blends like that. But if you just look at straight elemental nitrogen, right, in 2018, according to the Department of Food and Marine, we imported just over 400,000 tons of elemental nitrogen into Ireland. That's a colossal amount of nitrogen. If we look at the agri-product export value per kg of nitrogen used, right, from Ireland, the export value is 27.88, 27 euros and 88 cents per kg of chemical nitrogen. If we look at Holland, for instance, and again, we would see them probably as being heavy users, but their agri-product export value per kg of nitrogen used is 288 euros and 30 cents, right? And that's from Eurostat in January 19. Our figure is from Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine in 2019. 10 times the difference. So how efficient is our system?
Well, I think, Mike, we are running, we're over an hour and 10 minutes now. That figure is quite staggering. That is quite shocking. And we hear so much about, our Origin Green, the food island, our highly prized premium export, food and drink industry. And those figures just...
When you look at that figure, our Origin Green is chemical green. It's not natural green. And just where it's going right now, and you mentioned this earlier, now we're looking at protected urea, slow release nitrogen. So what's happening there? We're using a chemical now to inhibit the activity of urease enzyme. Right, it's that urease enzyme that releases the nitrogen from those chemical fertilizers. What people are not considering is that same enzyme in the soil is also releasing background natural nitrogen. And now we're putting an inhibitor into the soil to block that enzyme. That is the ultimate in soil sterilization. And this has gone on here for a couple of years now. And it's been recommended now that this is what we use, this is what we do. So what we are doing right now is sterilizing our soil and ensuring that it'll be very difficult for generations to try and utilize any natural background nitrogen. because we'll have locked up the ability of that urease enzyme. That's not a good way to go. And just one last point on that enzyme, that NBPT, it's it's registered in 2015 in the EU as a carcinogen. So if you look at the amount of nitrogen, 400,000 odd tons of nitrogen that we brought in 2018, we're recommending now to use slow release nitrogen. So at those kind of volumes, we are putting about 100 tons of that carcinogen per year onto our soils. That's not a good way to go.
So really, Mike, I mean, it's quite staggering. So not alone do we not have as if it made a difference, really, but not alone do we not have the trade-off of, if you will, monetary value per kilo of, whatever it might be, let's call it standard nitrogen as applied now, or protected urea. Not alone do we not have the trade-off of, look, at least we're getting export earnings from this. We're getting bang for our buck. But the real bang we're getting is the bang in terms of the soil microbiome. So we're actually progressively worsening the state of our soils, increasing it in future decades, a dependence on ever greater quantities of this slow release nitrogen, all while we're not actually generating the revenues, which in fact, if we were generating the revenues, if we were generating Dutch-like revenues, we may in fact generate the prosperity to actually undo some of the damage. So really we're getting a, if I could just use a slang term, a double whammy. We're just doing potentially untold damage in multiple ways and really locking ourselves into a very, very bad situation.
Absolutely, yeah. And when you look at it like that, now look at the relevance and the importance and the significance of multi-species that don't need that nitrogen.
So essentially, that's one problem. That's not even to speak about the biological issues, the soil microbiome, the soil mining for minerals, the compaction issues that they can alleviate, the anthelmintics, the pollinators and the invertebrate biodiversity so really, if we were to bring phytodiversity into swords, we could, in one fell swoop, almost, if there's anything akin to a magic bullet, phytodiversity or multiple species incorporation into our swords is probably the single best practice that we could engage in.
Absolutely. But we can only successfully do that if we don't apply chemical nitrogen to those multi-species swords.
Well,
Let
Mike,
them do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah. And I mean, on that note, let the plants do what they're supposed to do. That's a lovely nugget of wisdom, I think, on which to finish the show, Mike. And I mean, thank you so much, because that's been a really information-rich environment. You've given us almost an hour and a half, an hour and 20 minutes of your time generously, all told about an hour and a half. And you've given us freely of your advice, your wisdom, your experience, your knowledge. Hopefully it's been educational, as has been said to me by quite a number of individuals who've seen the show. Hopefully it's been educational for you, our viewers. We have run out of time. This has been the last in the current series, in series 1, our initial series, and hopefully we'll have many more, of Grassroots. And at this point, I'd just like to say a special thank you to all our guests. Now, I'm going to try to name all of our guests. In episode 1, we had Jennifer and Stephen O'Reilly, and we had John Deegan. In episode 2, we had James Foley and Jeremy Holland. In episode 3, we had Derry McGovern and Dave Taylor. In episode 4, we had Susanna Crampton. We had Kevin Dooley, and we had Fergal Byrne. In episode 5, we had Robbie Byrne and Tom Fuhy. Episode 6, Peter Ballerstedt and Seamus May. Episode 7, which was last week, we had Liam Lysett and we had Fintan Damer. And last but not least, we had Mike Walsh this evening, ladies and gentlemen. And I am so relieved that I've remembered all of the guests on this series. Ladies and gentlemen, to you, our viewers, you can watch back this episode and all of our previous 7 episodes on all our platforms. Please feel free to let us know what you think of the show. If there are topics that you would like us to cover, or if you have other suggestions, recommendations, or observations, please feel free to share them in the comments section on Facebook. You'll also be able to see us on Twitter and YouTube. We're hoping to have another series of Grassroots, another information-rich and educational program for you. Lastly, I just want to thank the Irish Inquiry, Stephen, and all the backroom team for providing the platform, providing the technical assistance. It's been a wonderful collaboration, and hopefully, it's done good things for the Irish Inquiry, in as much as it's certainly done good things for us and brought the message of alternatives in agriculture and food production and the environment and climate and health and all of those good things to a wider audience. Hopefully, we will see you later on in the year. We're going to take a summer recess. So please have a lovely summer. Stay well. Hopefully, we'll see you again in the autumn. Agus go mé mi dirash le chéile I mi manfior no jerafor banachti orv goléir agus slán go fól. From Grassroots, good night.